I never thought my life would take the direction it took. I was born and raised in Barcelona, surrounded by its vibrant streets, lively markets, and the whispers of the Mediterranean in the distance. My name is Alejandro, and as much as I love my city, I always carried an emptiness inside me, something I couldn't explain until that fateful day. It was a spring morning. The clear sky reflected the blue of the sea. I was at a cafe in the Gothic Quarter, my favorite place to watch people. While drinking a strong coffee, I noticed a woman sitting alone, her gaze lost in the direction of the Santa Maria del Mar Cathedral. She is just another tourist, I thought, but there was something in her eyes that called to me, as if she held a secret that somehow related to me. At that moment, I received a message. It was from my best friend, Lucas. He suggested a trip outside the city, to Montserrat, where the monastery was on a mountain surrounded by mystery. I needed a break from the routine, so I agreed. What I didn't know was that this decision would change everything. When I arrived in Montserrat, the mist embraced the mountains like a curtain of secrets. We climbed to the monastery, and while exploring the trails around, something caught my attention. A small wooden box, hidden under a pile of stones. "Hey, look at this," I called to Lucas, but he was already ahead, taking pictures. Curious, I picked up the box. Inside it, there was an old photograph of a young woman holding a baby. In the background, an inscription in Catalan, El camí per trobar la veritat. The path to find the truth. My heart raced. The woman in the photo was the same one I had seen at the cafe. But how was that possible? And what did that phrase mean? Something inside me said that this discovery was connected to something bigger. And so, the emptiness I always felt began to be filled with a mix of curiosity and fear. The photograph didn't leave my mind. Lucas noticed my silence as we descended from Montserrat, but I didn't have the courage to tell him. After all, how to explain something I didn't even understand? That night, back in my apartment, I sat at the table with the box in front of me. The photograph was worn by time, but the inscription was still clear. I decided to search for the meaning of the phrase on the internet, but the results didn't take me anywhere. It was as if this message was a puzzle waiting to be deciphered. The next day, I returned to the same cafe in the Gothic Quarter. She was there again, the woman with deep eyes, lost in thought. I gathered my courage and approached her. "Excuse me, I know this may seem strange, but I think I found something that might be yours." I showed her the photograph. She raised her eyes, confused. "Where did you find this?" I explained about Montserrat, the wooden box, and how surreal this coincidence seemed. Her eyes widened and she turned pale. "My name is Clara. This photo is of my mother and my brother, but he disappeared when he was a baby." Her voice trembled. "My God, where exactly did you find this?" I told every detail, and she listened attentively, almost holding her breath. When I finished, Clara took a deep breath and said, "This is not a coincidence. My grandfather always said that Montserrat held answers to our family secrets. but I never imagined they were real. Something inside me told me that I was linked to that story in a way I couldn't yet understand. Clara suggested we return to Montserrat together, but this time to explore the trails more deeply. A week later, we climbed the mountains again, but now with a sense of purpose. Clara brought an old diary of her grandfather, which mentioned hidden symbols in the monastery and nearby caves. We followed the diary's instructions, and soon found a hidden entrance among the rocks. The cave was dark and damp, with the sound of water droplets echoing in the distance. In the center of the cave, there was an inscription carved in the rock. Noms els valents coneixeran la llum. Only the brave will know the light. Clara pointed to a small hole in the wall, where the wooden box fit perfectly. Hesitantly, I placed it there, and a mechanism was activated. The walls trembled, revealing a narrow tunnel illuminated by a soft light. We entered together, our hearts racing. At the end of the tunnel, we found a room with walls covered in ancient writings and an altar in the center. On the altar, there was another box, larger and more ornate. Clara opened the box with trembling hands. Inside, we found more photographs, all of her family, and a medallion with the same symbol carved in the rock. When I held the medallion, I felt an inexplicable connection, as if something was being activated inside me. Alejandro, this is not just about my family, Clara said, her voice low and hesitant. I think you are part of this too. My mind was spinning. Who was I really? And how was my life so deeply intertwined with hers? The discovery in that cave changed everything. When we left there, the sun was beginning to set, tinting the mountains of Montserrat with golden and pink hues. It was as if the universe was sending us a sign. But inside me, what was growing was not peace. It was a mix of anxiety and insatiable curiosity. In the following days, Clara and I delved into the photographs, the medallion, and the ancient writings that were in the box. We discovered that the inscription on the altar was not just a symbolic phrase. It was part of a map, a puzzle that would lead us to the next destination. One of the photographs caught my attention. It was of a mountain village with a church in the center. In the background, the mountains were the same as Montserrat. Clara confirmed that it was Val de Núria, a small, almost inaccessible village, surrounded by stories and mysteries. Alejandro, we need to go there. This place seems to be the next piece of the puzzle. I agreed, but something unsettled me. Clara seemed increasingly connected to what we were discovering, as if she were reliving old memories. For me, it was the opposite. I felt like a stranger who had stumbled into a story I shouldn't have known. We arrived at Val de Núria after a long train journey and a hike along the trails. The village seemed untouched by time. Small stone houses, surrounded by imposing mountains and an almost sacred silence. Clara seemed to know the place, even though she said she had never been there before. She went straight to the church, where we found an old priest. He welcomed us kindly, but when he saw the medallion, he became visibly uncomfortable. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice grave and cautious. Clara explained quickly, but the priest interrupted. This symbol is older than this church. It belongs to a secret that even I should not know. He took us to a room at the back of the church and showed us an old mural hidden under a heavy cloth. It was the same symbol as the medallion, surrounded by drawings of mountains, stars, and human figures. This is what we call El Pacti. They say it is a pact between man and something greater, something that has inhabited these mountains for centuries. Whoever follows this symbol will find the truth, but will pay a high price. The priest's words echoed in me like a warning, but Clara was determined to continue. Following the mural as a guide, we climbed a steep trail to an old stone tower at the top of the mountain. The tower was in ruins, but in the center, there was a staircase that descended to the underground. Clara descended first, lighting the way with her flashlight. I followed her, the sound of our steps echoing in the narrow walls. Downstairs, we found a room similar to the cave in Montserrat, but much larger. In the center, there was a stone pedestal with an old book. The air seemed denser there, laden with something we couldn't explain. Clara opened the book carefully, and I saw her face change as she read. She handed me the book, pointing to a specific page. There was a drawing of a baby and an inscription in Old Catalan that said, El segon fill perd is la claw. The second son, lost, is the keen. Alejandro, this talks about me and my missing brother. Clara said, her eyes filled with tears. But why are you here? Before I could answer, the ground began to shake, and the room was filled with a deep, guttural sound, like a roar coming from the bowels of the earth. Something had been awakened. I couldn't breathe. The underground room seemed alive, pulsating with an energy that left me panicked. Clara, however, seemed almost hypnotized. The book trembled in her hands, and her gaze was fixed on the words we had just read. We need to get out of here, I shouted, trying to pull her towards the stairs. She hesitated for a moment, but then something changed. As if waking from a trance, Clara held my hand tightly, and together we ran towards the stairs. We climbed with difficulty as the tower walls seemed to groan and close around us. When we finally reached the surface, the silence was overwhelming. The village of Valda Nuria was distant, and the sky, once clear, was now covered with dark clouds. Clara and I leaned against a rock, trying to catch our breath. Alejandro, this is not just a search for my brother. She looked at me, her eyes full of determination. It's something much bigger. I feel as if destiny has brought us here. Clara, what if we are playing with something we don't understand? The priest said this has a price. She sighed but didn't answer. Instead, she opened the book again that she had managed to save. There was more information there, including a map that seemed to point to another place. Girona, a city a few hours away from there. We decided to go, but this time the weight of the decision was different. Every step we took seemed to bring us closer not only to answers but also to something dark and unpredictable. We arrived in Girona in the early evening. The narrow streets of the old quarter, with their worn stones and yellow lanterns, created an atmosphere that oscillated between cozy and unsettling. The map in the book led us to an old building that was now a bookstore. Inside, we found an old woman with a piercing gaze, as if she already knew why we were there. When Clara showed the medallion, she frowned and led us to a back room full of manuscripts and ancient objects. "You have opened a path that was dormant," she said, her voice low and serious. "This book is part of a secret kept for generations. Your brother, and maybe you too, young lady, are connected to this." Clara was about to ask questions, but the woman interrupted her. "There is one last place you must visit, an abandoned monastery in the northern mountains. There you will find answers, but be careful. What you seek may not be what you expect." The next morning, we set off for the monastery. The climb was tiring, but Clara was determined. Along the way, she began to tell me more about her brother, Miguel. He disappeared when he was 7, and the family never knew what happened. Clara always felt something was wrong, but she never had proof, until now. We arrived at the monastery at dusk. It was a massive structure, overgrown with moss and silenced by time. Upon entering, I felt a chill run down my spine. We explored every corner until Clara found a locked room. Using an improvised tool, we managed to open the door. Inside, we found an altar with the same symbol as the medallion. Clara touched the altar, and a low, almost imperceptible sound began to fill the room. The floor around us lit up with ancient inscriptions, and a holographic figure appeared in the center of the room, a man who seemed to be a monk. "You have come this far because you seek the truth, but the truth requires courage and sacrifice." Clara took a step forward, facing the figure. "What happened to my brother?" The monk smiled sadly. "He is beyond this world, but his journey is not yet over. You, Clara, are the key to balancing what was lost. But you can only continue if he is freed." The figure disappeared, and Clara fell to her knees. I knelt beside her, holding her as she cried silently. "Alejandro, this is bigger than we imagined." She said, "I don't know if I am ready, but I know I can't give up." It was at that moment that I realized Clara was not just searching for answers. She was searching for redemption, for herself and for the brother she lost. The room seemed to have absorbed all the energy around us. The air was heavy, filled with something we could not explain. The monk's words still echoed in my mind. He is beyond this world, but his journey is not yet over. Clara stood up slowly, her face still marked by tears. The old book was in her hands, now with pages that faintly glowed, revealing new texts we could not read before. "Alejandro, if he is beyond this world, does that mean I can bring him back?" she asked, her eyes fixed on the words that were appearing. "We don't know what this might cost, Clara," I replied, trying to hide my own fear. She ignored my warning and began to decipher the instructions. The words seemed to guide her to a small staircase hidden in the corner of the room. We descended in silence, our footsteps echoing in a narrow corridor illuminated only by the flickering light of our lanterns. The corridor led us to an underground chamber even older than the rest of the monastery. In the center, there was a circle drawn on the floor, surrounded by symbols that glowed in a faint golden hue. Next to it, a pedestal held an object that looked like a stone box, sealed with the same symbol as the medallion. Clara approached the circle and the pedestal. "This is the place," she murmured, almost as if speaking to herself. The book in her hands seemed to pulse, the pages moving on their own until they stopped on a spell or ritual. The instructions were clear. She had to recite the words and use the medallion as a key to open the box. "Clara, wait." I grabbed her arm. "What if this releases something we can't control?" She looked at me with a mix of determination and fear. "Alejandro, we have come so far. If this can bring my brother back, I can't stop now." Before I could say anything else, she began to recite the words from the book. The air in the room began to swirl, as if an invisible wind had been summoned. The circle on the floor glowed intensely, and a low sound, almost like a chant, filled the space. Suddenly, the stone box opened with a deafening bang. From within it, an intense light emerged, accompanied by an indistinct figure, like a shadow in the middle of the glow. "Miguel?" Clara whispered, her voice full of hope. The figure took a step forward and gradually began to take shape. It was a child, but his eyes shone with something that was not human. He looked at Clara, and for a moment he seemed to be the brother she lost. "You brought me back, but I am no longer just Miguel." The child's voice was a mixture of sweetness and something deeply unsettling. Clara ran to him, but before she could touch him, he raised his hand, creating an invisible barrier. "What have you done?" I asked, feeling panic rise. The ritual did not just bring him back. It brought something else, something that was waiting for this moment. Miguel's voice said, now deeper, almost threatening. Clara fell to her knees, the realization hitting her hard. "Miguel, forgive me. I just wanted to save you." The figure took a step forward, and for a moment, it seemed like all was lost. But then, something unexpected happened. The medallion on Clara's neck glowed intensely, and the barrier around Miguel began to weaken. "Clara, the medallion. Use it," I shouted. She held the medallion tightly and, guided by instinct, pressed it against the symbol on the floor. An explosion of light filled the room, and the wind stopped abruptly. When I opened my eyes again, Miguel was there, now looking like a normal boy. Clara hugged him tightly, tears streaming down her face. "You did it, Clara," I said, feeling immense relief. But the relief was brief. The monk appeared again, this time clearer and more imposing. "You completed the ritual, but the balance has been broken. The future depends on what you will do now." Clara looked at me, and I knew this story was far from over. Miguel fell asleep in Clara's arms, exhausted, as if the effort to return to this world had drained all his energy. The glow in the medallion disappeared, leaving only a cold and silent object. The monk continued there, his solemn presence filling the space. You brought your brother back, but the consequences will be felt for a long time. The balance between worlds has been affected, and forces that were dormant may awaken. Clara looked at him, her face a mixture of gratitude and fear. No matter what happens, I brought Miguel back. I will do whatever it takes to protect him. The monk nodded, as if recognizing her determination. The medallion no longer belongs to this world. It must be destroyed. I held the medallion, hesitant. It was the key to everything, and now it seemed to carry a weight greater than we could bear. And if we need it again? I asked, looking at Clara. Then we will have to find a different way, she replied, her voice firm. The monk indicated the circle on the floor. Place it in the center. The remaining energy will be enough to undo its power. Reluctantly, I placed the medallion in the circle. As soon as it touched the floor, the symbol began to glow again, but this time in a reddish-orange hue, like live embers. The medallion started to disintegrate, fragmenting into dust, until it disappeared completely. The chamber fell silent. The monk, now more translucent, gave one last warning. You must live with the choices you have made. Protect this boy, but remember, the world will always seek balance. And then he disappeared, leaving us alone in the cold, silent chamber. Clara and I climbed the stairs with Miguel in our arms. The monastery seemed different now, emptier, as if it had lost something fundamental. As we left, the dawn light illuminated the surrounding mountains, bringing a sense of peace we hadn't felt in days. What now? I asked Clara as we walked back to the car. She looked at Miguel, who was sleeping peacefully. Now we rebuild. Together. The following days were full of uncertainties. We took Miguel to a doctor, and surprisingly he seemed fine, like any other child. But from time to time, we noticed something strange in his eyes. A subtle glow, as if a part of that other world was still with him. Clara devoted herself entirely to caring for Miguel, while I did my best to investigate what else might have been awakened in that chamber. We couldn't ignore the monk's warning, but we also knew that, for now, we had something precious: time. The world seemed normal, but we knew it wasn't the same. Every sunset, I wondered if we were truly safe or if we had just delayed the inevitable. Clara, however, kept her determination intact. No matter what happens, Alejandro, we won. We brought Miguel back, and if necessary, we will fight again. I smiled at her, though my heart was heavy with doubts. We might never have all the answers, but one thing was certain. We had faced the impossible together. Months later, Miguel was playing in the garden, his laughter filling the air with a lightness we hadn't heard in a long time. Clara watched him from the window, a gentle smile on her face. He seems happy, I commented, approaching her. He is happy, and that's what matters. But, in the distance, on the mountains, a shadow seemed to move against the sunset. Maybe it was just my imagination, or maybe it was a reminder that the balance still needed to be restored. For now, however, we chose peace.